Hello, thanks so much for joining me here today. I'm delighted to be part of this event. I wish I could be there with you in person. I know it's an in-person event and an online event. Sadly, I'll just be joining remotely, but I know many other people are as well. So whether I was in the room or here on the live stream, I'm just very happy to be involved. So thanks for having me. Let's get right into it. We're going to talk today about getting to the glass. What does that mean? I mean, maybe this is an expression you've come across before. Maybe it's new to you. If you work in web development or are just interested in web development at all, you may think that, well, is this something to do with, the feeling we get, when we're trying to work with JavaScript dates? Dates in JavaScript are all kinds of fun, particularly if you're dealing with time zones and daylight saving, and all kinds of funny things can happen. Or if we're thinking about what's the future of interface design, is AI going to really be something that's really optimized just for making people feel good about having a flirty voice talking to them? I don't know. You would be forgiven for all of those reasons for thinking that getting to the glass really is talking about reaching out for something to drown your sorrows in and stare off into the distance, into the fire. That's not what this is about at all. I promise you. This is an expression that I came across back when I was working at agencies. I did many years working at agencies, and clients were obsessed with this. The idea of getting to the glass. How quickly can we get the content from wherever it originates to the screen, to the glass of the screen, right there, ready for the users to interact with, whether that's the screen on the desktop or more regularly these days to the glass, the screen of your device. Time to glass is something that clients of agencies, clients of all sorts of people, were often really obsessed with, and rightly so. It's really important. How performant is your site? People would often be very obsessed with this. Clients would, during the proposal phase, they'd be really concerned about it, and be part of the proposal would be making sure we have a solution that offers good time to glass. Sometimes this got a bit forgotten during the design phase. That sometimes happens where the design takes over, and we're not too worried about how we actually make it performant, how we improve the time to glass. And then again, it gets obsessed. People get obsessed about it at the point that doing testing and delivery, and it's important throughout. Time to glass is such an important thing. And what factors come into the time to glass? What impacts, how well we render things, how quickly we get things into the view of the person receiving it? Well, this won't be any surprise to you seeing a diagram like this, where we're thinking about content which is served from a server through to the client, to the end user. Maybe there's something that's performing or take some actions that are taking place on the server. There might be some logic in place, some moving parts, if you like. Maybe in the client, in the browser, there might be some logic that happens there, some manipulation, some rendering that happens there on its way to deliver something to the glass or to the glasses of the user who's viewing this. Because there's more to it than just that. There's also the outbound, the request rather than just the response has to travel through this various infrastructure. There are network requests, there's DNS, there's load balancing. There's all sorts of complexity. You might say, we're talking about all the magic that does the things that gets the stuff to the place. Bit of a mouthful, although it's kind of descriptive. I was tempted to use that as the title for this talk, but I figured that was just too much to say. So I'm sticking to time to glass. My name's Phil Hawksworth. I'm a member of the developer education team at Netlify. I'm based in the UK, and my family thinks I work in computers. That's how they imagine me. I guess this is how they imagine me. I don't know. For many of you, you might have a similar situation. People working in development often get labelled as working in computers, but a bit more specifically than that, I work in the dev ed team at Netlify, and I'm delighted to be part of this event today. Now, I will be lurking in the chat, and I will be around for questions and answers at the end of the session. But in case you're watching this recorded later on, or in case you don't think of a question at the time that we're talking about it and you want to reach me later, you can find me in various places on social media, whatever that is these days, whether that's Twitter or LinkedIn or Threads or whatever it is. I tend to be Phil Hawksworth in all of those places. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with me in any of those places and ask me follow-up questions if you would like. Now, getting to the glass, let's talk a little bit about that. And specifically, how do we best do the job of getting to the glass? How can we best deliver rendered views to the user in the most performant way? Well, the answer to that, which is so many to answer to so many questions in web development, is it depends. Now, I'm very cautious about saying it depends, because that doesn't feel like it's really giving you value for money with this talk, but it depends is actually a really important answer, as long as that then leads us to ask follow-up questions on it depends on what, and we'll come back to that in a little bit later on, because I think it's fair to say that for all of us working in web development, particularly those who've been around in web development for a while, we might be kind of aware that trends in web development are kind of cyclical. We talk about that quite often, how trends come and go, and then they come back into fashion. I think of it a little bit differently to being cyclical, actually. I think of it in terms of it being like a pendulum. We see, the trends swing from one side to the other and then back again. I think of it more that way. And in case you're having some disillusion that this means it's kind of majestic and grand and respectful and regal, like some kind of pendulum on a grandfather clock, that's not the case, I'm sorry to say. It's actually the much more frenetic, shouty, in your face pendulum that you might find on the bottom of a cuckoo clock, who, by the way, are way more expensive than I realized. $499 for a cuckoo clock. Who knew? But it's the analogy still kind of holds, because this pendulum is expensive. It costs us a lot to kind of change our minds and follow the trends all the time. But I do think it's a bit of a pendulum, because we swing often from one extreme to the other. And it's difficult to know what to choose when we've got all of these options, particularly when there are so many extremes at play. I think there is always a sweet spot. There's a sweet spot for the right approach to take. And that's somewhere, you typically in the middle, or it's somewhere in this spectrum, and it might be here, this might be the sweet spot, or it might be here, or it might be here. We don't know. The important thing is it depends. It depends on so many things. And we've got a lot of options for how we build things on the web, how we render them on the web. A few of the acronyms that are floating around for CSR for client-side rendering, or SSG for static site generation, DPR for distributed persistent rendering. So many acronyms, so many meanings. It can be hard to choose which one is best. And when people ask what is best, I always say, it depends. Now, by this point, you're probably shouting at the screen saying, what does it depend on? And that's fair. There are lots of things that it can depend on. It can depend on the costs of those tools that you might be considering, and the budgets of your team and your project, the time that you have available to you for investing in leveling up the skills of the team or the development that it might take, the sustainability of the tools that you might choose. And by that, I mean the longevity of the platform that you might, or the tools that you might be selecting, how supportable they are, how maintained they are, right down to things like the environmental considerations from a sustainability standpoint. Power consumption is a really tangible expense for the projects and on a wider scale. So all of these things factor in. But of course, perhaps the most critical thing is the requirements of the project. Those are one of the factors that really will dictate what is the right tool to choose to deliver the project. And without knowing the functional and the non-functional requirements of our projects, it's very, very difficult to decide what tool to use. So it really does depend on all of those things. But there's something that I think is kind of common as an attribute we should always be striving for when we're delivering our projects, and that's simplicity. Simplicity is really something to strive for. And it's one of these things that I think is overlooked and undervalued. Something that's simple. I quite like things that are boring in terms of their implementation, because it tends to mean that they're easy to understand and easy to comprehend, easier to reason about, which means you're going to be able to support them for much longer. But simplicity is we shouldn't be any stranger to simplicity and the desire to strive for simplicity. It's actually one of the design principles of HTML and the web itself. The principles of least power is right there in the design principles of the web, and kind of reading this from the design principles, computer science has spent a lot of effort making languages which are as powerful as possible. Nowadays, we have to appreciate the reasons for picking not the most powerful solution, but the least powerful. That's Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, his writings in the design principles of HTML. And he's talking there about how to make things robust and sustainable and make them fault tolerant. And it's all by leaning towards the least powerful rather than the most powerful thing that can do the job. So I always advocate for people to simplify as much as possible, but no more. And that seems like a very flippant thing to say, a very obvious thing to say, because you wouldn't be able to simplify more than you can simplify. But sometimes we can go too far. And again, I'm talking about these extremes. We swing between trying to be as simple as possible and then just embracing complexity. And we wave between these two things, trends come and go, but I always advocate to make things as simple as possible, but no more. And pragmatism is really important. It's such an important attribute or value to have when we're designing how we build for the web. We need to be pragmatic rather than being absolute or being very dogmatic. We need to think about what's reasonable for an approach and think about, the factors on which our decisions depend. So when it comes to how we do the best job of getting to the glass for rendering quickly and which of these many confusing terms we use, I've seen a real swing from trends being everything being done on the server and then through to everything being done on the client. And we're kind of going back and forth a little bit. And where is the sweet spot? Well, let's unpack this a little bit. Let's talk about all the magic that does the things, that gets the stuff to the place. What are we talking about here? Well, to start with, in the good old days, I guess, if you like, we had servers. We had dumb web servers that just had assets on them, and when someone requested them, they gave the assets to them, and those were delivered to the client. Then we started to add some moving parts to the servers. We started to do things dynamically on the servers where they weren't just using pre-generated assets. They were generating the views on demand, maybe by talking to databases, applying templates, that sort of thing. And those, of course, were delivered to the client, to the web browser, if you like, to then be rendered into a view. And then over time, we started adding logic to that. So we added runtimes like JavaScript in the client, so that we could have logic happening there, and rendering started to happen there as well as in the server. And of course, getting things to the server required some sort of deployment and some sort of build process typically. And I got very excited at the point that once we'd started to kind of think about things happening on the client side and the server side, I got very excited about the prospect of more and more being done in the build. So before the user ever came along and requested things, and so that we could have dumb servers that were back to as they were before, dumb servers just serving static assets. And this gave rise to a model sometimes referred to as Jamstack, but effectively it's static hosting, which has been enabled by the fact that our build servers now can be so much more powerful. They can be automated, they can be predictable. So we can automate this process of generating views, rendering views for our sites, and then distributing them to networks of dumb servers, if you like, around the world, so they can be very performant. But if we're doing that, often the code that's happening in the client is thought of, well, that's where the dynamic things happen. And I'm an advocate for simplifying there as well. So I like to do as little as possible with JavaScript as I can, so that things are using the rule of least power. They're rendered already, they're discoverable by search engines, they're much more fault tolerant by doing as little, not necessarily none, sometimes none, but as little as possible in the client. So if we want to build dynamic, engaging things, and I'm advocating for simplifying the client and I'm advocating for simplifying the server, we need somewhere else that we can do some of the logic and this power. And I've started to really embrace serverless technologies, in particular edge rendering and edge functions that can be distributed around a network. It's this kind of third place, if you like. This place in the middle is the edge. Very unfortunate naming for this. Names in computer science are always difficult. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of what we can do with this. And you might be looking at this screen now and thinking it's getting a little bit busy. Didn't he say just a few minutes ago that we should be striving for simplicity? Well, hear me out. Let me try and just like demystify this diagram a little bit, because if I'm advocating for what's going to be happening on every request, and every request from the client to the server to bring about a view. This box here is kind of what's involved in that. The build, that happens beforehand. We can do that ahead of time. So any mistakes are visible to us rather than to the user. We can expose those ahead of time. And then we're simplifying what happens on the server. That's just dumb assets now. And we're potentially simplifying what's happening on the client. We don't need to do all of the rendering in the client, all of the DOM manipulation there in the client. So we've got this other place now that we can start to do some of the dynamic thing just by adding some logic there. And that's really exciting to me. It kind of opens up the idea of this model of we generate our pages in a build and we display our pages in the client. Fine, that seems standard. and then we enhance our pages at the edge. And critically, if we need to, because we don't always need to. There are so many types of sites that we can build for the web and that we need to build for the web that actually don't need any dynamic generation at all. That can be something that happens ahead of time. But if we do need to enhance them with something that's a little bit more dynamic or a little bit more real time, then that's the kind of thing that we can do at the edge to this model. So this flow, I'm really excited about, even though ultimately it's kind of boring. But again, boring is good. It means that we can reason about it much more easily. I'm excited about this pattern. I kind of want to convince you that it's an exciting pattern, not because it's going to flirt with us or make us feel good about the hoodie we're wearing, because it's got such potential. So what can we think of as an example to demonstrate this that we might be familiar with? Well, I thought long and hard about this, and the most relatable thing I can think of course, is Cookie Monster. Cookie Monster is the best thing. That's the end of that discussion. But sadly, I'm not really talking about this Cookie Monster. I'm talking about this Cookie Monster, the monstrous UI that we've been subjected to once there's legislation about how we inform users of cookies. Now, I hate this thing. I hate ever encountering it. I really, really hate the fact that it's off-brand. It's usually inserted in such a way that it doesn't kind of fit with the rest of the UI. It's got incomprehensible language in it. It's got this horrible dark pattern of trying to just let you hit the big accept button and just accept whatever it's trying to push at you, because that's the only UI it really kind of focuses for you. If you really look at it a bit more closely and see there is an area I can see to click on to review what I'm actually going to be accepting. Often it's got sketchy kind of click targets that overlap, so you end up accepting anyway. It just teaches users to be phished, and it's just terrible. Often it's in the way of all of the content of the screen, so it just again encourages you just to hammer through and hit that accept button. I hate these things, but we kind of need them sadly at the moment. So what can we do to make these better? Well, let's think about what the requirements of these things are. I mean, they need to display kind of conditional UI that someone can interact with, and they need to control cookies. They need to be able to kind of grant the ability to set cookies or not. Often that means that they're deployed as third-party client-side JavaScript, because again they're manipulating the UI and they're doing some conditional things. People don't want to have to build that themselves, so there's a lot of utilities just to drop in to do that. But sadly, they're really bad for performance. They really damage performance. They are a gate in front of the content in the first place, but also they just really kill performance, and they often deliver just a terrible interface. So it might feel like it's a kind of I don't know, a fluffy, not very consequential thing to have an example of, but you don't want to get this stuff wrong. You don't want to ruin things for your users. And also, Cookie Monster is not an unpleasant character if he's angry. Can you imagine this thing? We need to do this stuff right. So if we're going to think about, should we do this at the server, at the client, or in the edge? Well, maybe we don't want to add moving parts, more logic to the server of our applications. Maybe we don't want to do things client side because of the performance issues and the complexity that I mentioned before. This feels like a really good candidate for doing things at the edge as an enhancement, if you like. So just adding a tiny bit of logic there at the edge is a really good contender. Okay, so what does that look like? I made a little demo here that does exactly that. This happens to be just the boilerplate Remix demo site that's been deployed, and I added just this one edge function to my site for this purpose. And what it does, you can see down here, is that it embeds a little bit of UI. Now, this isn't exciting in terms of the UI, but hopefully this illustrates a point. And what's happening here is, this is just HTML that's been injected into the HTML response that's coming down the wire so that we can have this bit of UI. And the styles are injected, the HTML is injected, but there's no JavaScript necessary here to render it, and we've still retained control of that. Now, I really like the fact that there's no JavaScript there. There's no, or I should say, no client-side JavaScript. The edge function is JavaScript or TypeScript. But the point is that the HTML arrives complete. It's fully formed. There's no extra request that's necessary to happen. There's nothing that can fail or can get in the way of the rendering. It's just baked into the page. And this is only happening where it's necessary, because this can be location aware. Now, we haven't need to ask permission to do that, because we're not doing it in the client. We're doing it at the edge. We're doing it at the serverless function that's in the cloud, if you like, at the edge. So we can detect the correct locations that need this UI and only add that if it's required. I like that this is sandboxed from the rest of the code. This is a drop-in. This is a single function that we're serving as an edge function. It's not messing with my Remix code or whatever framework I was using. It's not messing with any other client-side code. It's just a single drop-in. And yet, site owners can control this. They control this UI because they're not having to use a third-party JavaScript for it. So let me talk about what that looks like. What does it look like to deploy or add an edge function to your site, your infrastructure? Well, there are lots of providers out there, lots of different places you can go to get this kind of functionality. I work at Netlify, so I'll illustrate this as a Netlify through Netlify's implementation of it. And what we do at Netlify is, if you want to add an edge function or a function to your site, you create a folder in your repo, a Netlify folder, and in there we create an edge functions folder, and then we can put TypeScript or JavaScript in there, and those will be available in this case as edge functions. And this is what a simple edge function looks like. This is the hello world edge function that if we hit the path that we set in the config object, there it is at the bottom there. Any request to that path will hit this edge function, and this is what will be returned. Now, that's not much use yet. Let's talk about what the actual this cookie consent implementation was. And so here we have a different edge function. This is a cookie consent .ts. This is a TypeScript file, and we've got a few things in here that we import. So the first thing is that we import is we get the context. This is something that's provided by this is a set of utilities that Netlify provides as part of this edge functions library, and that context allows us to get access to things like geolocation, the inbound and outbound requests and responses, and a few other goodies along the way, cookie control, which we're going to need for this. We also include import rather some boilerplate UI, the UI that we're going to render onto the page. This is a JavaScript string literal that we're going to embed on the page. And then we also have a list of territories. This is just an array of country codes that we're going to interrogate when we perform our logic. So then when we get to call our function, we do indeed look at our context, get the country code from there. So each request will get the appropriate country code. And then we can compare that to our list of territories that we know we have to display the cookie consent banner. And then we can perform our logic. Now, we perform that logic. We know we now have to display it, and we want to inject that into the response that we were going to be sending anyway. That could have been the response from a pre-generated asset, just an HTML file, or the output of whatever is upstream, be that a server render, a serverless server render, or some output from the framework. And what we're doing here is we're getting the response that was going to be delivered through context.next. And then from that, we're getting the text of that. Now we're really just looking at the response that we were going to be sending down the wire. So now we can populate our templates with the UI to kind of customize it for the country or the language, find the closing body tag, and just update the response to inject this into the page. So that means that when the response comes through, we've now injected this just for those countries that need it and nowhere else. Now this is happening without any JavaScript and with nothing happening on the server. It's just through this serverless drop-in. Now I really like this pattern. It's happening, it's enhancing the pages that need it, but it's doing nothing for those that don't need it, and it's also kind of getting out of the way and not adding any more cost to rendering. This is framework free, or rather I should say framework agnostic. It can happen with or without a framework, or with any framework, it doesn't matter. And it's doing that through the use of the kind of primitives of the platform on Netlify. So we've got access to the edge functions, cookie control, being able to put things on the CDN, and so on and so forth. So this pattern I really like. Cookie banners aren't the most exciting thing. What else could we use it for? Well, maybe we'll use it for things like customizing or localizing the times or whatever other content we want on a site. Perfect for things like this event, like an online event that's got start and stop times for items that we might want to localize for the user wherever they are. Or maybe we want to think about how we customize a product detail page. This is an area that I spent a lot of time working on when I was working on at an agency for various different kind of large brands, where they'd have very many SKUs, very many product pages, and the idea of pre-generating them all and then updating the pre-generated set of them all whenever pricing changed or stock levels changed, it wasn't really practical. But this approach, we could populate all of the content of a product detail page and just update things like, is it in stock or not? Or have we changed the pricing? Those details could be enhanced once the page is being delivered through something like an edge function in the same mechanic. I really like this pattern. And so the idea is that, well, generating our pages in advance, the work is done. Displaying our pages on the client rather than just showing the HTML, what we ship, without having to do the rendering on the client and maybe calling APIs from the client. I like that because the work is already done. Enhancing our pages as they kind of flow through an edge function, through a serverless function, that's really, really fast. We're talking about single digit, double digit milliseconds of operations to do this. And so I think it's easy to reason about, and it's very, very performance. It gets the content to the glass, if you like, very, very quickly. But you might be looking at this and going, well, this is fine, but what about data that's not close to the edge? People who are kind of familiar with this pattern have stumbled across this and realized that an edge function, if it's nowhere near where your data resides, this still incurs quite an expensive request response that could actually make things feel slower rather than faster. So how do we deal with that? Well, my boss, one of the co-founders of Netlify, wrote an article on this just the other day on the Netlify Developer Hub. And by the way, I'll share the links to all of these resources in the deck, so you'll be able to find these very, very easily. He wrote a post about how to make edge rendering fast, even though data might be distributed. And I won't unpick the entire thing, but the crux of it is this: when we're thinking about a user who might be in one place around the world, a long way from where the data resides. In this example, we're kind of recreating the Hacker News homepage and querying the Hacker News API. If the user's a long way from that, one of the things that we might do in order to get the data or the view to them is we'll do an edge render. We'll render something which is located close to them at the edge in an edge function. But since we're a long way from the data, that doesn't really help us. It's not getting us the content any faster. And so a common thing that we can do is actually add a utility API ourselves. So we'll just add an API of our own, which is a serverless function deployed on Netlify in exactly the same way as the edge function. And we can locate that close to where the data is. That's something that's available on the Pro and Up tiers on Netlify. So we can choose which territory we reside that function in, and then that can aggregate the data from wherever it needs and deliver that to the edge function for rendering. Now, the eagle eyes amongst you will have noticed that actually this isn't so far actually making our edge function any faster. We've still got to make that long trip. And that's true, but that's something that we can solve with some careful cache management. And so once we've got access to being able to manage the cache in a granular way, we can do things like use the stale while revalidate pattern so that the data that's returned from our API is cached until it needs to be updated around the CDN. So now this means that our edge functions can get their data very, very quickly and really do perform well and get content to the glass, to the user as quickly as possible. And the article talks about how to do that, but ultimately we're controlling the cache headers and the cache characteristics of the Netlify CDN through some headers. And I'll let you read that rather than read it to you. And we're running short on time, but I will talk about quickly a similar kind of emerging pattern, which is PPR, or partial pre-rendering. Now, this is a pattern which is an experimental pattern currently kind of going through the motions in the Next.js framework. It's really interesting, and I think it's kind of an exciting approach, a little bit similar to the approach that I've just been describing, but it differs in a few ways. So rather than this approach that I've been talking about so far, the pages aren't necessarily generated ahead of time. Maybe they're generated in serverless functions, but not at the edge, but serverless functions that pass through our infrastructure to get to the client. But as they pass through, rather than being enhanced there, the data that's going to be needed to enhance them is, we make the request for that wherever that's coming from, and then we mark that in the body of the HTML, so that when that data is available, we fulfill the promise, but it happens in the client. So in other words, we set off these parallel requests for whatever data we need. We still pass the page along to the client, which renders, and then when the data is available, that's satisfied as a promise that updates the content client side. So it's a little bit different to what I was describing earlier on, but it has some similarities. Now, Next.js is looking to make this a real utility that kind of does it from start to finish. That all of the convenience is there for you to make that very easy to do. It's quite opinionated in the way that it does it, and I think it's very interesting. But it does make me think again of, well, we're swinging the pendulum, swinging again, isn't it, from things that are decoupled and kind of modular that you can piece together, and something that's a bit more monolithic, because it does everything from one end to the other. And so it depends on your taste of which approach you like for that. So again, there's another article again by Mathias Buhlmann, co-founder of Netlify, talking about actually how we can do partial pre-rendering if that's a pattern you're interested in without a framework. You actually don't need Next.js to do that at all. And so there's an article that talks about how you can do that, again, by controlling the primitives that we have available in Netlify. Okay, enough running to the end of my time. So did we learn anything along the way here? Well, I hope so, but a few things that I'll maybe call out as key takeaways. First one is rendering patterns are yours to control. We've got so many options available to us, and so we have the ability to make the choices that fit our needs. In order to do that, of course, we do need to understand the requirements, but by understanding the requirements and understanding what options are available to us and what tools and primitives are there for us to be able to make use of, means that we can make a choice. And I'd always advocate for starting simple and then building things up when simplicity doesn't allow. I'd always advocate for doing as much as possible in advance. That's not me saying that everything always has to be pre-generated. It depends, but I would do as much in advance as possible. I think of web development very much as like a restaurant. You don't want your mistakes to leave the kitchen. If you can have things that fail in the build before a user ever comes along to request things, all the better. The more we can do in advance, the simpler life gets when we're serving it, and the better experience and the more performant experience we can achieve. I'd say don't be hypnotized by the pendulum, this kind of swing from trend to trend that moves so quickly in web development. It shifts all the time. Be very aware that this thing moves and things might come back around again. We learn from experience, and then we'll see things return again. So don't just follow the trends. Really do consider what's the best choice that you need to make, and understand that it depends is a perfectly reasonable answer, as long as that then provokes the questions about what it depends on. The only exception to that is it doesn't depend, is the question, should I piss off Cookie Monster? And the answer to that is no, you never want to do that. Okay, so thanks so much for your attention. Thank you for those people whose images I used here. The attributions are there, along with some links to other resources as well. I will now be hoping to talk and chat and have a time for a bit of Q&A. So yeah, thanks again for your attention. Thanks so much.
Hello again. Thank you so much for your great presentation.
Thank you.
But yeah, it's nice to hear that we have so much different patterns to render, to pre-render, to decide of. And you at the beginning you mentioned about we aim for simplicity, and with this edge pattern we are kind of simplifying the backend and the client. But on the same time, we are adding a new layer of sort of abstraction in between that will enhance, will do something. So I'm wondering, what is your approach for actually testing testing, maybe with integration testing, all this pipeline. So definitely it should be maybe a slightly different from the typical approach, maybe because there is the new things that in between, and how to test it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm very conscious of that. I mean, you saw the slide where the diagram got more and more complicated, and then I kind of realized, I did say we were trying to keep it simple, and I think although that diagram looks more complicated and there are more layers, each layer does become way more simple. So there are fewer moving parts and there are fewer bits of infrastructure that you have to manage the infrastructure yourself. So I think when it comes to testing these things, this actually removes some of the variables, because when we're using things like edge rendering, we're using serverless functions as a service. So in other words, we don't have to worry about differences in the machinery that's running those. We don't need to be managing the servers ourselves for that and kind of making sure that they're patched and up to date and all of those things, which takes a whole load of the variables out of the equation. It's one of the reasons I quite like using kind of pre-generation and serverless functions wherever possible, because it means the things that I have to test and replicate in my development environment, my Q&A environment, my staging environment, my production, it's very easy then to make those identical, which makes things like testing way more predictable. All of these things that I've shown here today, those operate in such a way that when you're developing them and you're deploying your kind of development and your QA version of these environments and these applications, the environment is identical from one situation to the other. You don't have to think about keeping those all in step and kind of a good facsimile of each other so that you've got a predictable testing environment. So it does mean that the tests that you run against your development and your staging environment are just they faithfully reproduce what's going to happen when they're promoted to production. So that actually does simplify the approach to testing and to kind of troubleshooting these things. I like the fact that when you're building in this way, and I think when I started working at Netlify, it felt like this was a fairly new paradigm, but it's very, very common now, that we will get a replicated environment for every branch in our Git repository, for instance, so that you have a URL for that, which is effectively the same as your production URL in the same environment. So it means that we can test these things in a very, very predictable way. So you're right to say we're adding another layer in here, but all of the layers get simpler, and some of them can even get taken out of the equation entirely. I think of the server, the web server that's running, or the application server. I try and think of that as being as dumb as possible, wherever I can, which means that testing that part of the infrastructure also just gets simpler. So yeah, I think it does it gets easier rather than more complex, even though it appears you're adding more layers.
Yeah, thank you. Great to hear. Another question, maybe about all those functions in between. What is your suggestion on how maybe are there any limits on how many such function it makes sense to maintain? I mean, the number of features, number of enhancement may grow uncontrolled. Someone would like to add something about security, some maybe header, another one, cookie policies, another function may, I don't know, change the time like you suggested. And at some point it might be hard to control what actually what function do we have. Do you have any suggestion on how to manage all of them?
Yeah, so that's another great point, and I think that's a very similar situation to if we were building in any other way. The more functionality we add, the more
Hmm.
complexity we add. The thing I would say is that in this situation, it does this model of building things in these standalone functions does mean that we've got good encapsulation, good kind of separation of what each thing does. So that does mean that it can be a little easier to maintain. However, it is tempting sometimes to chain these things together and have one function being, a resource which is then called by another function and so on and so forth. And we need to be very careful about that, because that can start to gradually increase latency and reduce performance if we don't model that very, very carefully. So we do need to be very thoughtful about how we're chaining these different functions. But I do think that this model does give a good opportunity to have very good, clear vision into what the complexity is that you've introduced. It's slightly different to having a monolithic application where by design things are often very kind of tightly coupled, and so I think we need to be very, very careful about that in those situations. And I think this environment does lend itself to kind of loose coupling and tight cohesion and all of those kind of good practices. But it's like anything, you've definitely got the power to do things badly if you go down that route. And a common mistake is making many of these functions kind of be a dependency of each other. So you end up this kind of many requests going backwards and forwards across the network in a ways that you have to be much more conscious of in this environment than you would if you were building in a monolithic application where things are residing close to each other. So it's one of those kind of you gain in one respect and you lose with the other. But if you're thoughtful about it, then you can be okay. But it's being aware of that is the key, I think, and just changing that mindset as you're building.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. There is always a way to make it wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation.